The long gallery of Ellingham was the coldest room in the house at dawn, and Clara Mercer had always known it. She moved through it now with her father's tool roll tucked under one arm and her traveling coat buttoned to the throat, her breath making small clouds in the gray light that came through the tall windows. The great clock at the far end stood where it had always stood, stopped, silent, its hands fixed at the hour Gideon's brother had died, and Clara did not slow her pace as she passed it. She had learned in the course of a year not to look at that clock too long. It had a way of asking questions she had not yet decided how to answer. She crossed the marble floor without ceremony, and when she reached the mantelpiece beside the east door, she paused only long enough to set her wedding ring down on the stone. No performance, no backward glance, just the small, bright sound of gold meeting cold marble. And then she walked on toward the door, where Joss waited outside in the lane with the cart and the horse and the particular patience of a 10-year-old boy who has been told twice already that they are leaving before the house wakes. She was 3 steps from the door when Gideon appeared in the corridor to her left. He was dressed, which surprised her. She had assumed he would still be sleeping. He stood in the doorway to the passage that led to the east wing, and he looked at her traveling coat and her bundled tools and the empty space on the mantelpiece where the ring had been. And he said nothing for a moment. He had always been a man who could be silent without it being weakness. "Where are you going?" Gideon asked. Clara stopped walking. She did not turn all the way toward him, only enough to answer honestly, which was the only way she had ever known how to answer anything. "Home," she said, "to Clerkenwell, the workshop. The year is not done." 2 days remain, Clara said, "but I will not stay here waiting to be released like a settled debt. You told your solicitor last night that I am free. I heard you through the library door. So I am going, and I am going now, while the morning is still early enough that Joss will not be cold on the cart for long." Gideon did not move from the doorway. He looked at her with the expression she had spent 11 months trying to decipher. Controlled, careful. Something held back behind the formality that she had always read as distance, and had never quite managed to read as anything else. "Clara," he began. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it, which made it harder to say. "For the year. For the workshop. For what you did with Crane. I know what it cost you." She picked up the tool roll from where she had set it briefly against the wall. "But I will not be the thing you acquired when you were trying to do something right. I am not a debt that got repaid in the settlement." She walked out into the frost. The door closed behind her, and the gallery fell silent again. And the great stopped clock stood at the far end of the room and marked nothing at all. 363 days before that morning, Clara Mercer had not yet met the Duke of Ellingham. She had been in the workshop in Clerkenwell 3 days after her father's burial, standing at the bench where Josiah had stood for 30 years, trying to decide whether grief was something you were allowed to feel before you had dealt with the practical consequences of it. The practical consequences arrived before she had settled the question. Aldous Crane came through the workshop door at 9:30 in the morning, and he brought with him a solicitor, a debt ledger, and a written contract. And he had the particular confidence of a man who has never been refused anything he was prepared to pay for. The journeymen were at their benches. The apprentice was at the wheel. Joss was sitting on the stool in the corner where he always sat when he was at the workshop, watching everything with the large, dark eyes that had been Josiah's eyes. And Clara had time to register the presence of the boy before Crane opened his mouth and made it impossible to think about anything except what he was saying. "The estate of Josiah Mercer," Crane said, addressing the room rather than Clara specifically, his voice carrying easily past the journeymen and out through the open window into the street, "is in arrears to my firm in the amount of £412, accumulated over 6 years of commission advances and material loans. The terms of the original agreement," he held up the contract, "include a provision signed by Josiah Mercer in his own hand, pledging his daughter Clara as collateral against default. As the estate cannot satisfy the debt, I am here to enforce that provision. The workshop went entirely quiet. One of the journeymen set down his tool. Clara heard it hit the bench. She had been holding a pocket watch movement. She had picked it up automatically when Crane came in, the way she always reached for something mechanical when she needed to think. And she was aware of the weight of it in her palm, and the fact that her hands were perfectly steady, which surprised her. "My father," she said, "never signed a contract that pledged a person as collateral. He would not have known how to write such a provision, and he would not have agreed to one. His signature is on the document," Crane said pleasantly. "Then the document is false," Clara said. The room was still very quiet. Crane smiled the way men smiled when they believed the outcome was already decided, and the conversation was merely courtesy. It was at that point that a second man stepped forward from the back of the small crowd that had gathered near the door. A man Clara had noticed when Crane came in, but had not yet placed, tall and dark-coated, standing slightly apart from Crane's solicitor in the manner of someone who is present by coincidence rather than arrangement. He was perhaps 38 or 39, with a face that gave very little away, and he spoke without raising his voice. "I commissioned Josiah Mercer 7 months ago," the man said, "to assess a clock at my estate in Hertfordshire. I have correspondence from him dated across the past year. None of it mentions an arrangement of this kind." He looked at Crane. "I would be interested to know the date on that contract." Crane's smile did not entirely disappear, but something behind it shifted. "And you are?" "Harcourt," the man said. "Gideon Harcourt." The solicitor beside Crane wrote something in his notebook. One of the journeymen near the back of the room let out a short breath that was almost a word. Crane recovered himself. "The contract stands, Your Grace, regardless of your correspondence with the deceased. The debt is a matter of record." "Then it will be a matter for the courts," Gideon said. He turned to Clara. "Miss Mercer, would you walk with me for a moment?" Clara set the pocket watch movement down on the bench. She looked at Crane, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man calculating odds. And then she followed Gideon through the door at the back of the workshop, into the small room where Josiah had kept his reference library and his private notebooks. Gideon closed the door. He did not sit down, and neither did she. "I want to be plain with you," he said, "because I think you are a woman who prefers plain speech to circumlocution." "I am," Clara said. "Crane has money and a solicitor and a document that will take months to disprove, even if it is false. Which I believe it is. The law as it stands gives him tools to make your life very difficult, regardless of the outcome. The workshop, the commissions, the boy's situation, all of it becomes uncertain while the dispute runs." "I know that," Clara said. "There is a way to remove his legal hold immediately," Gideon said. "Marriage annuls the provision. A wife's person is not pledgeable collateral under a father's debt. The courts have been consistent on this point. If you marry before Crane files formally, his contract becomes unenforceable." Clara looked at him. She had met him exactly once before, when she brought the stopped clock from his estate to the workshop for Josiah to inspect. And he had been precisely as he was now. Formal, direct, and impossible to read. "And what would you want from such an arrangement?" she asked. 1 year, Gideon said. He said it simply, without preamble. "I'm asking for 1 year, with a single condition. The workshop stays in your name. Your brother keeps his place. Crane cannot touch either of you. And at the end of the year, if you cannot love me as a man, not as someone who performed a service for you, not as a rescuer, not as a creditor of a different kind. Then you leave with everything intact, and you owe me nothing. The marriage dissolves. You keep the workshop, the boy keeps his position, and I bear the legal cost of the separation." Clara was quiet. She turned to the bench beside her, Josiah's reference bench, covered with the notebooks and reference drawings he had spent his life accumulating. And she picked up the movement of a pocket watch that had been left there for cleaning, turned it over in her fingers, and set it down again. "Why?" she said. "Because I commissioned your father to assess a clock that has been stopped for 3 years, Gideon said. "And because I watched him work for 2 days, and I thought he was one of the finest craftsmen I had ever seen. And because Crane used him and discarded him. And I find I'm not willing to watch him do the same to you." "That is a reason to be charitable," Clara said. "It is not a reason to marry someone." "No," Gideon said. "It is not." He paused. "I would like the year." Clara stood still for a moment. Then she said, "On one condition of my own. You will never mistake my compliance for gratitude. If I stay, it is not because I am in your debt. If I go, it is not because I am ungrateful. Those two things are separate from anything that happens between us." "Agreed," Gideon said. She held out her hand, not to shake it, but to take his, which she did firmly, and she turned and walked with him back through the workshop door to the bench where the great clock movement from Ellingham sat in its crate, waiting for Josiah's assessment that would now never come. The mechanism was heavy and cold when she lifted it onto the bench. She took Gideon's hand without asking permission and pressed it flat against the side of the movement, guiding his fingers to the place where the mainspring had failed. The specific point of fracture, the exact location of the break. "There," she said. "That is where it stopped." His hand was warm against the cold brass. Both of them went still for a moment, his fingers under hers, the broken spring beneath both of them. And then she released him and turned back to the workshop and said yes. The marriage was performed 4 days later in a solicitor's office near Gray's Inn, witnessed by the solicitor himself and by Joss, who shook Gideon's hand with the gravity of a boy who understood that the occasion required seriousness, and then asked whether the Duke's house had a dog. Gideon said it did not, but that there was a stable cat named something he could not quite remember, and Joss appeared to find this satisfactory. Clara and Joss moved into Ellingham the following week. The house was very large and very cold, staffed by people who were polite in the specific way that signals they are waiting to observe what mistakes will be made. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, showed Clara to her rooms with a courtesy so perfectly calibrated that it communicated nothing except that Mrs. Aldridge had formed no opinion yet, and intended to form one carefully. The footmen were correct. The cook was civil. Everyone was watching. Gideon did not eat with them the first 3 evenings. He sent word each night through the footmen, estate business, correspondence that required his attention, a matter with the solicitor in town. And Clara accepted each message without comment, and ate with Joss at the long table in the small dining room that was apparently the informal one, though it was larger than the entire ground floor of the Clerkenwell workshop. On the 4th evening, Gideon appeared at dinner, and he was formal in the way of a man who has decided that formality is the safest gift he can offer. Present, courteous, asking Joss about his studies, and asking Clara about the workshop's current commission list, and volunteering nothing of himself. Clara, who had spent 33 years learning to read mechanisms, began to wonder what he was protecting. In the meantime, she could not keep her hands still. The house was full of clocks, bracket clocks, long case clocks, a beautiful French carriage clock on the library mantelpiece, a set of 4 matching movements in the upstairs hall, and most of them had not been wound in months, some in years. She began, without asking permission from anyone, to wind and regulate them. She started with the carriage clock because it was the most neglected and because French escapements of that period had a particular vulnerability she recognized from one of Josiah's notebooks. By the end of the first week, 5 clocks that had been silent since before she arrived were keeping accurate time, and Mrs. Aldridge reported this development to Gideon at breakfast in a tone that implied she was not certain whether it was a problem. Gideon, Clara was told later by Joss, who had been sitting in the corner of the breakfast room in his customary fashion, had looked up from his correspondence and said only, "Good." The great clock in the gallery she did not touch. She understood without being told that it was not hers to touch. Not yet. Possibly not ever. Crane filed his petition to the court 6 weeks after the marriage, disputing its standing on the grounds that the debt provision predated any legitimate claim Gideon might have had on Clara's situation, and demanding that the debt be assessed independently of the marriage. The petition named the workshop's contents, the tools, the commission inventory, the reference library, the notebooks, as assets to be considered in the settlement. It was a careful piece of legal work, and it was clearly designed to run long enough to exhaust her. The creditors' gathering was held at a solicitor's office in the city, and Crane arrived wearing the expression of a man who has already counted the money. He addressed the room. 4 creditors, 2 solicitors, a clerk, and a commissioner. As though Clara were a piece of furniture that had been brought along for reference purposes. He referred to the workshop's contents as property acquired by the Duke through the marriage. He spoke about Josiah's debts as though Josiah himself were present to hear it. And he spoke about Clara's situation as though she had no opinion of her own about it. Gideon put his hand on Clara's back. It was a single, quiet gesture. His palm flat between her shoulder blades, not gripping, not steering, just present. And he said, in the same tone he had used when he told Crane his name in the Clerkenwell workshop, "The workshop and its contents belong to my wife. They have belonged to her since her father's death. I would ask that the room proceed with that established." He said wife with no particular emphasis, but the word landed before anyone could respond. And Crane looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but something between the two. That evening was the first of the working nights. Crane's legal filings cited specific entries from Josiah's notebooks as evidence of the debt arrangement. Entries that Josiah had written in his private cipher, the compressed notation system he had developed over 40 years of workshop practice, and which Clara had grown up reading the way other children grew up reading plain English. The citations were mangled. Whoever had transcribed them for Crane's solicitor had not understood what they were looking at. But they needed to be answered in plain notation for the commissioner's record. Gideon and Clara sat across from each other at the library table after Joss was in bed, the notebook spread between them, and Gideon read aloud while Clara translated. He had a good reading voice, steady, unhurried, with the natural rhythm of a man who had read aloud to someone before. And he did not stumble over Josiah's abbreviations, even though they were largely meaningless to him, which she found she respected. On the third such evening, she was tracing a numeral sequence across the bottom of a page, a calibration record that Crane's solicitor had cited incorrectly, the kind of error that would be obvious to anyone who understood what they were reading. And she said without looking up, "There, that sequence. Follow it from the 7 to the dash to the bracketed figure." Gideon leaned forward to look, and he lifted her hand to follow the line of numerals she was tracing. His fingers closed around hers to guide them along the page, and then he held her hand there, at the end of the sequence, for a beat longer than the task required. She was aware of ink on her fingers. She was always aware of the ink. and of the warmth of his hand over hers, and of the fact that neither of them moved. Then he set her hand down, gently, and said nothing, and returned to reading. Clara looked at the page and did not say anything either. The confrontation at the workshop came on a Tuesday, when Gideon was at his solicitor's, and Joss was at his lessons, and Clara was alone at the bench working through a commission that had been waiting since before Josiah's death. A repeater watch with a striking mechanism that had been misbehaving for years, and whose owner had apparently decided that the change of management at Mercer's was an acceptable reason to wait. Crane came in without knocking. He was alone, which she had not expected. He looked around the workshop with the proprietary attention of a man assessing inventory. And then he looked at Clara, and he smiled. "I thought we might speak privately," he said, without the Duke present to perform his gallantry. "Say what you came to say," Clara told him. Crane moved to the far bench and picked up a gauge weight from the tray, not to look at it, just to hold it. The way men held things that belonged to other people when they wanted to establish that the objects were not sacred. "I am prepared to offer you a private settlement," he said. "The debt cleared, the petition withdrawn, the marriage annulled if you prefer it. You keep the workshop, you keep the boy, and you come and work for me, as your father did, completing the commissions I financed." "No," Clara said. Crane set the gauge weight down. "You are refusing because you think the Duke will protect you." "I am refusing because the answer is no," Clara said. "He will not trouble himself indefinitely," Crane said. "A man of his rank, a woman of yours, there is a limit to what a title can be made to do for sentiment. He married you to make a point. When the point is made, you will be precisely where you are now, except that you will have spent a year in a cold house in Hertfordshire, and you will have nothing to show for it." Clara set down the tool she was holding. She looked at Crane directly, and she said, "Get out of my workshop." Crane looked at her for a moment. He moved toward the door, and when he reached it, he turned back with the expression of a man who has one card remaining and intends to play it even if it reveals too much. "Your father was a brilliant man," he said. "Wasted on repair work. The real work, what he was actually building in the last year. That was worth something. Worth considerably more than a debt." He left. Clara stood at the bench after the door closed and looked at the tools in their rack and at Josiah's notebooks on the shelf above the bench. And she thought about the word building and what it meant when Crane said it. And she thought about what her father had been working on in the last months before he died. The project he had been secretive about. The one he had locked away when she came into the room. The one he had said only was nearly done and would change things considerably. She began to understand that the debt had never been the point. The understanding became certainty 6 weeks later. On a night when Joss came back from returning a book to Gideon's study, and found Clara still at the library table and stood in the doorway, with an expression she had learned to read as something seen that he did not know what to do with. "There was a man," Joss said, "in the lane below the study window. Tunstall was passing things out to him, wrapped in cloth, like the notebooks." Clara set down her pen. "Which notebooks?" she said. "Father's," Joss said. "The ones from the locked shelf." She found Gideon in the east corridor and told him in 3 sentences. He listened without interrupting, and then he went to find Tunstall. And Clara waited in the library with Joss and the lamp and the uncomfortable knowledge that the enemy had been inside the house the entire time. Tunstall confirmed it without much resistance. He had been approached by Crane 6 months before Josiah's death. Before the debt, before the contract, before any of it. Crane had paid him to watch, to report, and when the time came, to facilitate access to the notebooks. The object Crane had been working toward from the beginning was not the debt and not the workshop, and not Clara herself, but the marine chronometer that Josiah had been building in the final months of his life. A navigation instrument that was within weeks of completion when Josiah died. One that carried attached to it a board of longitude prize evaluation, and beyond that, a royal commendation that would make the instrument's maker a name in every naval office in England. Without Josiah's cipher, the final calibration sequence could not be reconstructed. Without the cipher, the chronometer was an unfinished object. And without Clara, no one alive could read the cipher. Tunstall was dismissed that night. The notebooks were locked in the library with the key in Gideon's coat pocket. The house went quiet. Gideon and Clara sat across the table from each other in the lamplight, and Clara set her hand on the table between them, not reaching toward him, just placing it there, palm down, as though she needed to feel something solid. Gideon covered her hand with his. They remained that way for a long while, and neither of them spoke, and the lamp burned steadily. And outside the library windows, the night was very still. Clara began work on the chronometer the following evening. She brought it up from the workshop lockbox and set it on the library table. Josiah's last project. The incomplete instrument that had been the real target of everything Crane had done for the past 2 years. And she looked at it for a long time before she touched it. It was extraordinary work. Even unfinished, she could see what it was going to be. The precision of the escapement, the elegance of the temperature compensation, the particular solution Josiah had found for the rate error that had defeated every other marine chronometer maker working on the longitude problem. He had been so close. Gideon sat across from her and read the notebooks aloud as she needed them, finding each entry she asked for with the efficiency of a man who had spent weeks learning Josiah's organizational system. The work required both of them. Clara's hands and her knowledge of the cipher, Gideon's voice reading the entries in the exact order she needed. And it pulled them close in a way that had nothing to do with proximity, and everything to do with the fact that they were building something together. One careful night at a time. Crane's response to losing Tunstall was to move faster. He filed a court order against the workshop's contents on the grounds that the chronometer had been built using his financing, which was technically true since the material loans were real, even if the debt provision was fabricated. And he argued that the instrument therefore belonged to his claim regardless of who had built it. The Board of Longitude's evaluation deadline was fixed and immovable. The instrument had to be submitted for assessment by a date that was now 6 weeks away. On the evening before Crane's court motion was to be heard, Clara and Gideon were both leaning over the nearly completed instrument, and she was fitting the final compensation weight to the balance wheel. And the work had brought them close enough that she was aware of his shoulder near hers and his breath near her temple. And she looked up from the instrument, and he was looking at her, and the space between them closed to almost nothing. The messenger knocked at the library door. Gideon straightened. Clara stepped back. She took the document from the footman and read it standing, and the moment passed without either of them crossing the remaining distance, and neither of them acknowledged that there had been a distance to cross. But the closer the work brought her to him, the more she pulled away in the hours between. She began taking her meals earlier, before Gideon came down. She answered his questions in shorter sentences. On 2 occasions, she returned to the workshop alone in the middle of the night, rather than sit with him in the library after the evening's work was done. And she told herself it was because she needed the quiet. And she knew that was not the entire truth. The truth was that she was beginning to understand what it would feel like to be wrong about him. And being wrong about him would mean that she had spent her life being wrong about something larger, about whether she was, in herself, something worth choosing. Josiah had been brilliant, and had been used, and had died with a debt that was not really a debt. Clara had been competent and careful, and had kept her hands busy, and had not wanted anything she could not afford to lose. If she let herself want Gideon, not the arrangement, not the protection, but him, the man who sat across the library table and read her father's words aloud in the lamplight. And if she was wrong about what it meant, she would have lost something she had not known she was carrying. She worked on the chronometer. She did not explain any of this to him, and he did not press her. The commissioner's hearing was held on day 360, in a room at the Board of Longitude's offices that smelled of old paper and coal smoke and the particular staleness of authority exercised in small spaces. Crane's solicitor presented the contract, the original document, the one that named Clara as pledged collateral, and laid it before the commissioner with the confidence of a man presenting a final argument. The commissioner examined it. He asked several questions about the debt provisions. He looked at the signature. Clara had been sitting at the table throughout, and she had not spoken, and Gideon had not spoken, and Crane had looked at her twice with the expression of a man who believes the ground beneath him is solid. "There is a date notation in the contract's margin," Clara said. The commissioner looked up. "The notation in the upper right margin of the third page," Clara said. "The date format. My father began using that format. The day abbreviated before the month, with a dash rather than a stop, in the autumn of 1817. Before that year, he used a different convention, which you can verify against any of his commission records or correspondence. The date written in the contract is 18 of 15. My father would not have written a date that way in 1815. The room was quiet. The commissioner looked at the document again, and then at the commission records that had been submitted as evidence, and then at the document again. "It is a small thing," Crane said. "A copying error." "The contract is in his hand throughout," Clara said. "It is not a copy." The commissioner set the document aside. He asked Crane's solicitor 3 further questions, none of which the solicitor answered satisfactorily. And then he ordered the contract set aside and the petition dismissed. Crane stood up from his chair. He looked at Clara across the table, and she met his eyes, and she did not look away. And after a moment, he looked at something past her shoulder instead, and walked out of the room. By day 362, the chronometer was complete. Clara cased it herself, checked the rate over 24 hours, and submitted it to the Board of Longitude under her name as completing instrument maker, with Josiah's name on the original design. She wrote the submission letter at the library table, while Gideon sat across from her reading his correspondence, and she did not tell him what she was feeling when she signed it, which was something she had no accurate word for. Something between grief and pride, and the specific ache of finishing a thing that someone else had begun. She walked past the library that evening on her way to her rooms, and she slowed at the door because she could hear Gideon's voice inside, speaking to his solicitor. She stopped. "The year is nearly done," Gideon said. "The lady is to be released as the arrangement specified. I want to confirm the legal position." The solicitor's voice, lower, said something she could not fully hear. "She owes nothing," Gideon said. "She is free. Make certain the paperwork reflects that." Clara stood outside the library door and heard released and free, and she did not knock. She walked to her room. She began packing before midnight, working by candlelight, folding things carefully, and rolling her father's tools into their canvas case with the same attention she gave to everything that required precision. And she did not cry, because she had decided long ago that crying was for situations in which you had not seen the outcome coming, And she had always known this was how it would end. She had known from the beginning that she was useful. She had known what she was for. She left Ellingham on day 363, before the house was fully awake, with her father's tools under her arm and Joss waiting on the cart in the frost. And she set the wedding ring on the mantelpiece without ceremony and walked past the great stopped clock toward the door. And Gideon stepped into the corridor and asked where she was going, and she told him. And she walked out into the cold morning and did not look back. Gideon did not send a letter. He sat in the library for a long time after the door closed, and then he went to his solicitor, and he did not say what he wanted to say, which was that she had heard him wrong. He said instead what he had decided to do, which was this: the entirety of the Board of Longitude prize, the money and the royal commendation that would come with the chronometer's evaluation, was to be signed over to Clara Mercer and her brother Joss. A separate deed was to confirm that the workshop was held in her name without condition, without any obligation to the marriage or to him. The marriage itself, if it continued, was to carry no material benefit to Clara that she did not already possess. No allowance revision, no estate entitlement beyond what had been guaranteed at the outset. Nothing that could be mistaken for a reason to stay that was not herself. If she came back, it would have to be because she chose him, not the title, not the prize, not the workshop he had helped her keep. Him, the man who had sat across a library table from her for months reading her father's words aloud, who had put his hand on her back in a room full of creditors, who had covered her hand with his in the lamplight after Tunstall's betrayal, and held it there in the quiet because there was nothing adequate to say. And he had not wanted to offer nothing. He told the solicitor nothing further. He returned to Ellingham and he waited, which was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than inheriting a title meant for someone else. Harder than watching his brother's clock stop and knowing he would never wind it again. He waited because pursuing her would have been another kind of pressure, another kind of use. And he understood her well enough now to know that she would recognize the difference between a man who came after her because he could not bear to be without her and a man who came after her because he could not bear to lose. He had promised her freedom. He kept the promise. In Clerkenwell, Clara reopened the workshop on day 364. She unlocked the door and let the morning light in and stood at Josiah's bench for a moment before she put on her apron and picked up the first commission from the waiting list. Joss sat on his stool in the corner and watched her work and did not ask questions because he was 10 years old and he had learned to read his sister the way she had learned to read mechanisms, by watching what she did rather than listening to what she said. The post arrived at 9:30. There was a letter from the Board of Longitude. There was a second document, folded separately, with a solicitor's seal. Clara read the Board of Longitude letter standing at the bench. She read it a second time. Then she set it down and read the solicitor's document, and she stood there for a while with both pieces of paper in her hands. "What does it say?" Joss asked. "The prize has been awarded," Clara said. "To us. The money and the commendation." "To us?" Joss said. "He signed it over," Clara said. "All of it." Joss was quiet for a moment. "Why would he do that?" he said. Clara set both documents on the bench. She picked up the tool she'd been working with and set it down again. She looked at the workshop, at the bench where Josiah had stood, at the rack of tools, at the clocks in their various states of repair, at the shelf where the notebooks had sat before they went to Ellingham's library. And she thought about what it meant to give something away when you did not have to. What it meant to make yourself nothing to someone so that they could choose you freely. She worked until dark without speaking again. And that night she took the last page of Josiah's design from the drawer in the back room, The final calibration sheet. The one that completed the chronometer. The one she had copied from his notebooks and kept. And she sat at the bench with it for a long time. And she understood something she had been wrong about for 363 days. On day 365, the year expired, the clause dissolved, nothing between them obligating anything. Clara left Joss with the journeyman and walked to Ellingham. She walked the whole distance. It took most of the morning, and the road was cold and the sky was low and gray, and she did not mind any of it. She needed the time to know her own mind. And by the time the gates of Ellingham appeared at the end of the lane, she knew it completely. She walked through the house without stopping to speak to anyone. Mrs. Aldridge saw her in the entrance hall and said her name, and Clara said good morning and kept walking. She went directly to the long gallery. The room was as cold as it always was in the mornings, gray light coming through the tall windows, the marble floor pale and still. The great clock stood at the far end, where it had always stood, its hands fixed at the hour Gideon's brother had died, 3 years of silence held in its case. Clara crossed the gallery. She found the key on the hook beside the case, where it had always been. She had noticed it the first week and had not touched it, and she reached for it now without hesitating. She opened the case. She set the key to the winding arbor and turned it, feeling the spring take up the tension with the particular resistance of a mechanism that has been still for a long time, and she wound it fully and carefully. And then she set the pendulum in motion. The clock caught. The escapement engaged. The pendulum began to swing, and the tick of it filled the gallery. Steady, even, unhurried. And the hands, freed from their long stillness, began to move. Clara stood back and listened to it. She heard Gideon's footsteps in the doorway behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She listened to the clock for one full swing of the pendulum, and then she turned to face him. He was standing at the threshold of the gallery, very still, watching her. He looked at the clock, and then at her, and his expression was the one she had spent 11 months trying to read. Except that she understood it now. She understood what the control was covering, and what it cost him to hold it, and what it would cost him to let it go. "I wound it," Clara said. "I came back on the day after the year ended, when I owed you nothing, and you owed me nothing, and the clause was dead. I came back because I chose to, not because I was required to, not because you came after me, not because I was grateful. I wound the clock because I wanted to start the time again." Gideon said nothing. He crossed the gallery toward her, and she watched him come, and she did not step back. "I heard what you said to the solicitor," she said, "that night outside the library. I heard released, and I heard free, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought it was the arrangement ending. I thought you were counting the days until you could close the account." "I was counting the days," Gideon said. His voice was not entirely controlled. "I was counting them because I was afraid you would leave, and I had promised you that you could, and I could not take the promise back without making it mean nothing." "I know that now," Clara said. "I understood it on the morning the prize arrived. You gave away the money and the commendation and everything that came with it, and you kept nothing for yourself, and there was only one reason to do that." "There was," Gideon said. "You wanted me to be able to come back with nothing owed and nothing given," Clara said, "so that if I came, it was real." "Yes," he said. She kissed him first. She reached up and kissed him once, deliberately, with the full intention of it. And his hands came to her face, and he kissed her back with everything he had been holding back for 365 days. And neither of them spoke for a long moment after. The clock marked the quarter hour. The sound of it moved through the gallery like something restored. "I am not easy to be with," Clara said when she could speak again. "I work too late, and I do not talk about what I feel, and I am going to keep the workshop." "I know," Gideon said, "and Jost needs the stool by the bench." "He can have any stool in the house," Gideon said. "He can have the chair from the study." "He would like that," Clara said. The great clock ticked steadily behind her, marking time for the first time in 3 years, and the gray morning light came through the tall windows of the gallery. And Clara Mercer, who had spent her life believing that precision was the only thing she had worth offering, and that desiring was for people who could afford to be wrong, stood in the gallery of Ellingham and let herself be held by a man who had given away everything he could give so that she could choose freely, and found that she was not afraid. The workshop at dawn, a week later, was the warmest it had been in years. All the clocks marked the hour together. The bracket clock on the shelf, the carriage clock from the library that Clara had carried down herself, the long case in the corner that had been silent since Josiah's time, and the great gallery clock now resting on the bench for cleaning, its pendulum removed, its case open, its movement laid bare and gleaming under Clara's hands. Jost sat on his stool beside her, watching the way she held the mainspring, learning the angle of the wrist that kept the tension even. He was asking a question about the escapement, and Clara was answering it with the patience she had always had for the things that mattered. On the bench beside the chronometer's empty case lay the last page of Josiah's design, the final sheet, completed now in Clara's hand, the calibration sequence finished, the notation clean and certain. At the bottom of the page, where Josiah had always signed his work, Clara had signed it instead. Mercer. The clocks ticked on. Outside, the morning was beginning.